Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a fascinating puzzle, a real head-scratcher in the world of education. We're going to dive deep into the big disconnect between what policy says and what actually happens on the ground in Japan's English classrooms.
All right, let's just jump right into the big question, shall we? For decades, I mean decades, Japan has been pouring effort into English education. But, and this is a big but, the national proficiency levels, they've stayed surprisingly low. So what gives? What's really going on here?
Well, the source material we're digging into today really highlights this massive gap. You've got these major policy shifts, right, all geared towards real communication. But then there's what's actually happening in the classroom, and it's like the government's goals and the day-to-day reality are on two completely different pages. Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this, we gotta start by looking at just how persistent this problem is. And this quote from Masumi Tahira at Temple University really hits the nail on the head. The argument here isn't that the new policies are wrong, not at all. It's that there's been a serious lack of real, meaningful support for the teachers. The people who are actually on the front lines trying to make all this work. Now, what's so interesting here is that this isn't some new issue that just popped up. Nope, Japan has been working on this for over 60 years. And as you're about to see, the official approach has kind of swung back and forth like a pendulum. This timeline really paints the picture. Back in the 40s, it was all about the audiolingual method, listening, speaking, forming habits. But then, in the 60s, the pendulum swung hard the other way to the grammar translation method, all about rules and structures. Then comes 1989, and this was a huge turning point. Suddenly, developing communicative ability is the main goal. That idea got a major boost in 2003 with an action plan that basically said English is essential for the 21st century. All right, and that brings us pretty much up to date to the latest big game plan. This was the most ambitious set of changes yet, really kicking off around 2012. This was supposed to be the one that finally made it all happen. So first up, they cranked up the class time. A lot. For junior high students, annual English hours jumped from 105 to 140. I mean, the logic seems solid, right? More time in class should equal more learning. And they didn't stop there. They also beefed up the required vocabulary. Senior high school students suddenly needed to know 1,800 words, up from 1,300. Again, the goal was to give them a bigger toolbox to work with. But this next one, this was the real game changer. MEXT came out and said classes in principle should be conducted in English. Whoa. This was a massive signal that the old way of doing things, a Japanese teacher explaining English grammar in Japanese, was supposed to be a thing of the past. Okay, so you've got this bold new plan, right? More hours, more words, English-only classes. So did it work? Well, this is exactly where that gap we talked about, the one between policy and practice, turns into a giant chasm. Let's just look at the numbers. A survey from MEXT itself in 2010 laid it all out. Get this, even in oral communications courses, classes literally designed for speaking, teachers said that in almost half of them, students were speaking English less than half the time. That's not good. And this really lays out the two competing realities perfectly. The policy goal, it's all about students actively using the language, developing real communication skills. But the classroom reality, so often, it's still the teacher standing at the front, explaining grammar points, doing course reading, and drilling vocabulary. Two totally different worlds. So this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Why does this gap exist? Why do these ambitious, well-meaning policies just fall flat when they hit the classroom? Well, our source points to a few core reasons that all kind of pile on top of each other. First, the main idea of communicative language teaching is pretty vague. The guidelines just aren't clear to teachers, MEXT itself hasn't really explained things well, teacher training is insufficient, and there's the huge pressure of university entrance exams, which are still super focused on grammar. Yeah, let's talk about this term for a second. Communicative language teaching, or CLT. It's really at the heart of the issue. See, it's not some strict paint-by-numbers method. It's more of an approach. The whole point is that you learn a language by actually using it to communicate. But because it's so flexible, it's left a lot of teachers confused about what they're supposed to do day to day. And wow, nothing illustrates this ambiguity better than this quote. A MEXT official actually had to clarify that teach English in English doesn't literally mean you give a lecture in English all the time. They admitted it's often unrealistic, especially for explaining complex grammar. But here's the kicker. That clarification,
It's not in any of the official guidelines. It was just said in a magazine. So you can imagine how confusing that is for a teacher.
So when you take all of this together, the vague definitions, the lack of training, the exam pressure, the author argues it all points back to one single core problem. And here's the central argument. The failure of these reforms isn't because the goal is bad. It's because of a lack of commitment by MEXT to actually see it through. Think about it. For more than 2 decades, they've been pushing this idea of communicative teaching, but they've never really given teachers the clear instructions and the solid, ongoing support they need to make it a reality. And so that leaves us with the big question hanging in the air, right? Can Japan's ambitious policies and its classroom realities finally get on the same page? It seems the challenge isn't about dreaming up new goals anymore. It's about finally building that bridge between the two. And how to do that? Well, that's a puzzle that's still waiting for an answer.